Well, welcome to everyone, wherever you are, whatever time it is. And we've got a very special occasion today. We have Professor Aristotle Papanikolaou from Fordham University, his Archbishop Demetrius Chair in Orthodox Theology and Culture, and he's also co-director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham, a wonderful institution whose newsletter is fascinating. I get it every week. I'm most grateful. Well, he is going to introduce a reading from Dostoevsky. His talk is called Returning the Ticket, God and Evil, in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. So, Aristotle, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll just kind of dive in. I'm assuming people are familiar with Dostoevsky's famous novel, Brothers Karamazov. If not, I can maybe fill in the gaps afterwards. And of course, this is a very famous scene of Alyosha and Ivan, which actually is so famous that Penguin Books has like a small little publication of just this section. Penguin Books has just this section, which also, of course, includes the Grand Inquisitor as well, which I'm not including, but we can. There are a few passages there that I think are relevant, and we can maybe reference them or talk about them. But in general, I think I'd like to just address the question of, I think what Ivan says, it just gives us a chance to talk about the question of God and evil in general, quite honestly, just the question in general. And it's really the question surrounding, excuse me, the point of what we call theodicies, right? Attempts to explain how God and evil can coexist, how there can be a loving God when evil is in the world, etc. So I will, I'm supposed to speak for about 40 minutes, but we can have an open discussion right after I start reading as well. I want to maybe just see, maybe we can talk together about what Dostoevsky is trying to do here with Ivan and Alyosha as well. Because I remember my teacher, David Tracy, once saying, pay attention to Alyosha. He says, he never fights back. He never defends. He never proposes an alternative theodicy. Basically, he said he never responds. And so I think it would be important to also just see the figure of Alyosha too, like what's going on there, and that part of Dostoevsky's own response or struggles with this question, right? So I'm not going to read the whole Rebellion. Some of you are familiar with this, of course, know that Ivan gives us many examples of really horrible events. According to the footnotes, these are based on true events that Dostoevsky himself knew about. So I'm going to read the first one, and then I'm going to go to the general, and then talk about Ivan's conclusions, and then we can maybe kind of talk in general just about theodicies and what Dostoevsky is trying to do here. And then I'll just give you my own take, I guess, about how we should be thinking about this question, which I think has something to do with what Dostoevsky is trying to say. So I think hopefully this will be about just a 10-minute read, and I will I will read that, and then we'll just kind of just talk about this wonderful passage. So I don't know if it's going to come up on the screen or not, but I'm just going to begin. So chapter 4, Rebellion. I must make an admission, Ivan began. I never could understand how it's possible to love one's neighbor. In my opinion, it is precisely one's neighbor that one cannot possibly love. Perhaps if they weren't so nigh, I read sometimes, somewhere about John the Merciful, some saint, that when a hungry and frozen passerby came to him and asked to be made warm, he lay down with him in bed, embraced him, and began breathing into his mouth, which was foul and festering with some terrible disease. I'm convinced that he did it with the strain of a lie, out of love enforced by duty, out of self-imposed penance. If we're to come to love a man, the man himself should stay hidden, because as soon as he shows his face, love vanishes. Sounds a lot like Derrida. The elder Zosima has spoken of that more than once, Alyosha remarked. He also says that a man's face often prevents many people who are as yet inexperienced in love from loving him. But there is still much love in mankind, almost like Christ's love. I know that, Ivan. Well, I don't know it yet, and I cannot understand it, nor can a numberless multitude of other people along with me. The question is whether this comes from bad qualities in people or is inherent in their nature. In my opinion, Christ's love for people is in its kind a miracle impossible on earth. True, he was God, but we are not gods. Let's say that I, for example, am capable of profound suffering, but another man will never be able to know the degree of my suffering, because he is another and not me. And besides, a man is really willing to acknowledge someone else as a sufferer, as if it were a kind of distinction. And why won't he acknowledge it, do you think? Because I, for example, have a bad smell, or a foolish face, or once stepped on his foot? Besides, there is suffering and suffering. Some benefactor of mine may still allow humiliating suffering, which humiliates me, hunger, for example. But a slightly higher suffering for an idea, for example, no, that he will not allow, save perhaps on rare occasions, because he will look at me and suddenly see that my face is not at all the kind of face that he fancies a man should have who suffers, for example, for such an idea. And so he at once deprives me of his benefactions, and not even from the wickedness of his heart. Beggars, especially noble beggars, should never show themselves in the street. They should ask for alms through the newspapers. It's still possible to love one's neighbor abstractly, and even occasionally from a distance, but hardly ever up close. If it were all as it is on stage in a ballet, where beggars, when they appear, come in silken rags and tattered lace and ask for alms dancing gracefully, well, then it would still be possible to admire them, but still not to love. But enough of that. I simply wanted to put you in my perspective. I meant to talk about the suffering of mankind in general, but better, let us dwell only on the suffering of children. That will reduce the scope of my argument about 10 times. But even so, it's better if we keep to children. The more unprofitable for me, of course. But first, one can love children even up close, even dirty or homely children. It seems to me, however, that children are never homely. Second, I will not speak of grown-ups because apart from the fact that they are disgusting and do not deserve love, they also have retribution. They ate the apple and knew good and evil and became as gods. So let me go to the next page. And they still go on eating it. But little children have not eaten anything and not yet guilty of anything. Do you love children, Alyosha? I know you love them, and you'll understand why I want to speak only of them now. If they too suffer terribly on earth, it is of course for their fathers. They are punished for their fathers who ate the apple. But that is reasoning from another world. For the human heart here on earth, it is incomprehensible. It is impossible that a blameless one should suffer for another, and such a blameless one. Marvel at me, Alyosha. I too love children terribly, and observe that the cruel people, passionate, carnivorous, Karamazovian, sometimes love children very much. Children, while they are still children, up to the age of 7, for example, are terribly remote from grown-up people, as if they were different beings of a different nature. I knew a robber in prison. He happened in the course of his career, while slaughtering whole families in the houses he broke into and robbed at night, to have put the knife to several children as well. But he showed a strange affection for them while he was in prison. He spent all his time at the window, watching the children playing in the prison yard. He trained one little boy to come to his window, and the boy got to be very friendly with him. Do you know why I'm saying all this, Alyosha? I somehow have a headache, and I feel sad. You have a strange look as you speak, Alyosha observed anxiously, as if you were in some kind of madness. By the way, a Bulgarian I met recently in Moscow, Ivan Fyodorovich went on, as if he were not listening to his brother, told me how the Turks and Circassians there in Bulgaria have been committing atrocities everywhere, fearing a general uprising of the Slavs. They burn, they kill, rape women and children. They nail prisoners by the ears to fences and leave them like that until morning. And in the morning they hang them and so on. It's impossible to imagine it all. Indeed, people speak sometimes about the animal cruelty of man, but that is terribly unjust and offensive to animals. No animal could ever be so cruel as a man, so artfully, so artistically cruel. That's just a wonderful line. A tiger simply gnaws and tears, that is all he can do. It would never occur to him to nail people by their ears overnight, even if he were able to do it. These Turks, among other things, have also taken a delight in torturing children, starting with cutting them out of their mother's wombs with a dagger, and ending with tossing nursing infants up in the air and catching them on their bayonets before their mother's eyes. The main delight comes from doing it before their mother's eyes. But here is a picture that I found very interesting. Imagine a nursing infant in the arms of its trembling mother surrounded by Turks. They've thought up an amusing trick. They fondle the baby. They laugh to make it laugh, and they succeed. The baby laughs. At that moment, a Turk aims a pistol at it, 4 inches from its face. The baby laughs gleefully, reaches out its little hands to grab the pistol, and suddenly the artist pulls the trigger right in its face and shattered its little head. Artistic, isn't it? By the way, they say the Turks are very fond of sweets. What are you driving at, brother? Alyosha asked. I think that if the devil does not exist, and man has therefore created him, he has created him in his own image and likeness. I think that's a reference to Feuerbach, by the way. So let's go down now to page 242. Right, 242. So the first, I guess, full paragraph, about 2/3 of the way down. One more picture, just one more for curiosity, because it's so typical, and above all, I just read it in one of the collections of our old documents, the archive, antiquities, or somewhere. I'll have to check the reference. I even forgot where I read it. It was in the darkest days of serfdom, back at the beginning of the century, and long live the liberator of the people. There was a general at the beginning of the century, a general with high connections and a very wealthy landowner, the sort of man, indeed, even then they seem to have been very few, who, on retiring from the army, feels all but certain that his service has earned him the power of life and death over his subjects. There were such men in those days. So this general settled on his estate of 2,000 souls, swaggered around, treated his lesser neighbors as espongers and buffoons. He had hundreds of dogs in his kennels and nearly 100 handlers, all in livery, all on horseback. And so one day a house serf, a little boy, only 8 years old, threw a stone while he was playing and hurt the paw of the general's favorite hound. Why is my favorite dog limping? It was reported to him that this boy had thrown a stone at her and hurt her paw. So it was you. The general looked the boy up and down. Take him. They took him from his mother and locked him up for the night. In the morning, at dawn, the general rode out in full dress for the hunt, mounted on his horse, surrounded by spongers, dogs, handlers, huntsmen, all on horseback. The house serfs are gathered for their edification, the guilty boy's mother in front of them all. The boy is let out of the lockup, a gloomy, cold, misty autumn day, a great day for hunting. The general orders them to undress the boy. The child is stripped naked. He shivers. He's crazy with fear. He doesn't dare make a peep. Drive him, the general commands. The huntsmen shout, run, run. The boy runs. Sick him, screams the general, and looses the whole pack of wolfhounds on him. He hunted him down before his mother's eyes, and the dogs tore the child to pieces. I believe the general was later declared incompetent to administer his estates. Well, what to do with him? Shoot him? Shoot him for the moral satisfaction? Speak, Alyoshka. Shoot him, Alyosha said softly, looking up at his brother with a sort of pale, twisted smile. Bravo, Ivan yelled in a sort of rapture. If even you say so, then, a fine monk you are. See what a little devil is sitting in your heart, Alyoshka Karamazov. What I said is absurd, but that's just it. That but, Ivan was shouting. I tell you, novice, that absurdities are all too necessary on earth. The world stands on absurdities, and without them, perhaps nothing at all would happen. We know what we know. What do you know? I don't understand anything. Even Ivan went on as if in delirium, and I no longer want to understand anything. I want to stick to the fact. I made up my mind long ago not to understand. If I wanted to understand something, I would immediately have to betray the fact. But I've made up my mind to stick to the fact. Why are you testing me? Alyosha exclaimed with a rueful strain. Will you finally tell me? Of course I'll tell you. That's just what I've been leading up to. You are dear to me. I don't want to let you slip, and I won't give you up to your Zoshima. Ivan was silent for a moment. His face suddenly became very sad. Listen to me. I took children only as to make it more obvious. about all the other human tears that have soaked the whole earth through from crust to core, I don't say a word. I've purposely narrowed down my theme. I'm a bedbug, and I confess in all humility that I can understand nothing of why it's all arranged as it is. So people themselves are to blame. They were given paradise, they wanted freedom and stolen fire from heaven, knowing that they would become unhappy. So why pity them? Oh, with my pathetic earthly Euclidean mind, I know only that there is suffering, that none are to blame, that all things follow simply and directly from one another, that everything flows and finds its level, but that is all just Euclidean gibberish. Of course, I know that, and of course, I cannot consent to live by it. What do I care that none are to blame, and that I know it? I need retribution, otherwise I will destroy myself. And retribution, not somewhere and sometime in infinity, but here and now on earth, so that I see it myself. I have believed, and I want to see for myself. And if I am dead by that time, let them resurrect me, because it will be too unfair if it all takes place without me. Is it possible that I've suffered so that I, together with my evil deeds and suffering, should be manure for someone's future harmony? I want to see my own eye. I want to see with my own eyes the hind lie down with the lion, and the murdered man rise up and embrace his murderer. I want to be there when everybody suddenly finds out what it was all for. All religions in the world are based on this desire, and I am a believer. But then there are the children, and what am I going to do with them? That is the question I cannot resolve. For the 100th time, I repeat, there are a host of questions, but I've taken only the children, because here what I need to say is irrefutably clear. Listen, if everyone must suffer in order to buy eternal harmony with their suffering, pray tell me, what have children got to do with it? It's quite incomprehensible why they should have to suffer and why they should buy harmony with their suffering. Why do they get thrown on the pile to manure someone's future harmony with themselves? I don't understand solidarity and sin among men. Solidarity and retribution I also understand, but what solidarity and sin do little children have? And if it is really true that they too are in solidarity with their fathers and all the fathers' evil doings, that truth certainly is not of this world and is incomprehensible to me. Some joker will say perhaps that in any case, the children will grow up and have time enough to sin. But there's this boy who didn't grow up and was torn apart by dogs at the age of 8. Oh, Alyosha, I'm not blaspheming. I do understand how the universe will tremble when all in heaven and under earth merge in one voice of praise, and all that lives and has lived cries out, just art thou, Lord, for thy ways are revealed. Oh, yes, when the mother and the torturer whose hounds tore her son to pieces embrace each other, and all three cry out with tears, just art thou, Lord, then of course the crown of knowledge will have come, and everything will be explained. But there is the hitch. That is what I cannot accept. And while I'm on earth, I hasten to take my own measures. You see, Alyosha, it may well be that if I live into that moment or rise again in order to see it, I myself will perhaps cry out with all the rest, looking at the mother embracing her child's tormentor. Just art thou, Lord, but I do not want to cry out with them. While there is still time, I hasten to defend myself against it, and therefore I absolutely renounce all higher harmony. It is not worth one little tear of even that one tormented child who beat her chest with her little fist and prayed to dear God in a stinking outhouse with her unredeemed tears. Not worth it, because her tears remain unredeemed. They must be redeemed, otherwise there can be no harmony. But how? How will you redeem them? Is it possible? Can they be redeemed by being avenged? But what do I care if they are avenged? What do I care if the tormentors are in hell? What can hell set right here, if these ones have already been tormented? And where is the harmony if there is hell? I want to forgive, and I want to embrace. I don't want more suffering. And if the suffering of children goes to make up the sum of suffering needed to buy truth, then I assert beforehand that the whole of truth is not worth such a price. I do not finally want the mother to embrace the tormentor who lets his dogs tear her son to pieces. She dare not forgive him. Let her forgive him for herself, if she wants to. Let her forgive the tormentor her immeasurable maternal suffering. She has no right to forgive the suffering of her child who was torn to pieces. She did not forgive the tormentor, even if the child himself were to forgive him. And if that is so, if they dare not forgive, then where is the harmony? Is there in the whole world a being who could and would have the right to forgive? I don't want harmony for love of mankind. I don't want it. I don't want to remain with unrequited suffering. I'd rather remain with my unrequited suffering and my unquenched indignation, even if I am wrong. Besides, they have put too high a price on harmony. We can't afford to pay so much for admission, and therefore I hasten to return my ticket, and it is my duty, if only as an honest man, to return it as far ahead of time as possible, which is what I am doing. It's not that I don't accept God, Alyosha. I just most respectfully return him the ticket. That is rebellion, Alyosha said softly, dropping his eyes. Rebellion. I don't like hearing such a word from you, Ivan said with feeling. One cannot live by rebellion. I don't want to live. Tell me straight. I call on you. Answer me. Imagine that you yourself are building the edifice of human destiny with the object of making people happy in the finale, of giving them peace and rest at last, or that you must inevitably torture just one tiny creature, the same child who is beating her chest with her little fists, and raise your edifice on the foundation of her unrequited tears. Would you agree to be the architect on such conditions? Tell me the truth. No, I would not agree, Alyosha said softly. And can you admit the idea that the people for whom you are building would agree to accept their happiness and the unjustified blood of a tortured child, and having accepted it, to remain forever happy? No, I cannot admit it, brother, Alyosha said suddenly, his eyes beginning to flash. You asked me just now if there is in the whole world a being who could and would have the right to forgive. But there is such a being, and he can forgive everything, forgive all and for all, because he himself gave his innocent blood for all and for everything. You've forgotten about him, but it is on him that the structure is being built, and it is to him that they will cry out, just art thou, O Lord, for thy ways have been revealed. Ah, yes, the only sinless one in his blood. No, I have not forgotten about him. On the contrary, I've been wondering all the while why you hadn't brought him up for so long, because in discussions your people usually trot him out first thing. You know, Alyosha, don't laugh. I composed a poem once about a year ago. If you can waste 10 more minutes on me, I'll tell it to you. You wrote a poem? Oh no, I didn't write it, Ivan laughed. I've never composed 2 lines of verse in my whole life. But I made up this poem and memorized it. I made it up in great fervor. You'll be my first listener. Why indeed should an author lose even one listener? Ivan grinned. Shall I tell it or not? I'm listening carefully, said Alyosha. My poem is called The Grand Inquisitor, an absurd thing, but I want you to hear it. So I won't say too much. There's so much richness here that maybe we can open up a discussion, but one of the things that's very clear here is that so again, I'm sure all of you know this, that when it comes to the question of God and evil, we have this word called theodicies. And somehow we have to try to make sense, give reasons, explain what's going on, why there's evil, and how can we justify the presence of evil and still claim that God is good and loving and omnipotent and all these other things. And some of you know some of these theodicies. I mean, to say that there's a devil can maybe be a theodicy. It sort of gets God off the hook. To say that it's simply a result of free will, that's one of the more common theodicies. And there's a theodicy by the process philosophers, right? The process philosophers and the process theologians, that we're kind of getting God wrong, in a sense, that God really isn't omnipotent and omniscient the way we thought, but that, you know, God is somehow the great predictor, or but has more power to influence, but is not really in control in the way that we think, right? So that also seems to but Ivan here is clearly rejecting theodicies. He's clearly rejecting all theodicies. So that's maybe one of the first things we can talk about, is whether that makes sense. But he's rejecting all theodicies, and here he's not necessarily original. It's, you know, that's in the book of Job, right? That Job, of course, you're all familiar with the book of Job. But Job has his friends telling him, well, you must have done something. And that's a theodicy, like, this just couldn't have happened. You must have earned it. You must have done something wrong. And Job, I mean, it's really quite fascinating. A 3,000-year-old text, Job fights back. and says, no, I didn't. I reject all your theodicies. I reject your explanations. I reject your attempt to rationalize this or give reasons for it. And then, of course, as all of you well know, we have a dialogue between Job and God. And this is where, of course, there are different kinds of interpretations. Some interpret it as God telling Job just to be quiet and stop complaining. I do think that the Christian tradition gets this a bit wrong. And there's a book by Susan Schneider, I think, that written quite a few years ago, but that investigates that there's patience of Job, but I don't see very much patience in that book by Job. He does engage. I think what's interesting about the text is something that his friends are trying to give him explanation. But what's really interesting in the text is that God has to come down. What's also interesting in the text is that God does not explain it. God does not do what the friends do. God says things like, were you there when I made the moon and the stars, etc.? And my reading of this, and perhaps we can also discuss this, my reading is that God is saying, look, even if I tried to give you an explanation, you wouldn't be able to get it. You don't have my vantage point. And my read of that situation is God is basically telling him, look, you wouldn't be able to understand. There is no way to understand. Perhaps there's even no understanding of it, but you have to trust me. And of course, Job says, okay, and then ultimately gets everything back. That's my read of the book of Job. I mean, the other person who we can mention following in this line of rejecting theodicies is Elie Wiesel. If you read Night, but if you read the first volume of his memoirs, it's really very powerful. There's a famous scene in Night where the boy is hanging on the gallows. And some people like to interpret that as sort of the suffering God, because Wiesel recounts how he said in that moment that there is God hanging on the gallows. And some people interpreted that as sort of an affirmation of Nietzsche's death of God, and Wiesel rejects that. But some people interpret it along the lines of the suffering God, sort of the crucified God. And Wiesel also rejects that. He says, what good is it if God suffers along with us? Why must he add his suffering to ours? And then Wiesel says something really, really, really powerful. And of course, we all know Elie Wiesel maintained his faith. He maintained his faith, so he didn't reject God. He wasn't an atheist. But he said something really possible. He said, if God were to come down and give me an explanation of why the Holocaust happened, I think I would reject it. I mean, that's a very powerful statement. Even if God and God's self were to come down and say, here's the explanation, Wiesel would say, I don't care, I reject that. So I think what the general point I'm trying to make here is, when it comes to the question of God and evil, we think we have to have the right explanation, the right answer, the right theory, right? Maybe even the right theology. But we have clear witnesses in human thought, tradition, even, our own tradition with the book of Job. Here, Dostoevsky, I include as a great thinker within our tradition, that simply reject this move. They reject it. Not only that, but I read in this passage that Dostoevsky thinks it's actually kind of dangerous, right? And that's where, going back, and I'll just say a couple of things and then I'll stop. And then back on page 243, when Ivan says, about 2/3 of the way down, he says, I don't understand anything. And I no longer want to understand. See, that's what theodicies try to do. They try to give us understanding as if our faith somehow were based on that. I no longer want to understand. I want to stick to the facts. I made up my mind long ago not to understand. If I wanted to understand something, I would immediately have to betray the fact. that line, betray the fact. The way I read it is that what Dostoevsky is saying through Ivan is that theodicies are betrayals to the victims. The attempt to explain it is to some extent almost a betrayal, a misremembering of the horror that victims experience. It's kind of like they're more for us than anything. It's kind of like this. Maybe I'm being a little too simplistic. It's kind of like, yeah, the Holocaust happened, but that but, right? See, that's what he says. I see it's that but. He doesn't want that but. The Holocaust happened, but the Nazis will go to hell, and we don't have to think about that anymore. So theodicies can perhaps make us complacent. They can perhaps get us to feel, like we don't really need to be on guard, be aware, to respond. Theodicies, ironically, seem there to kind of strengthen our faith, but in a way they can almost get us to miss the point. And so if there are if we shouldn't engage in theodicies, if the point is not to engage in theodicies, then what should we do? And I think Wiesel, again, the answer is in Alyosha, right? In as much as humanity is capable of being artistically cruel, and that's such a great line, right? I mean, artistically cruel. I mean, we always talk about what differentiates humans from animals is our reasoning capacity, our will, but really what differentiates humans from animals is part of what differentiates us is our capacity to be artistically cruel, right? And I think in the person of Alyosha, Alyosha is the response. In other words, that insofar as humans have the capacity to be cruel, they also have the capacity to be like Alyosha, right? To be like Alyosha, and to be like Zosima, that there are Alyoshas and Zosimas in the world. And their presence really is the only response to evil. And you see that throughout the text. Alyosha is like a magnet of goodness. Everybody just wants to latch onto him, right? And Wiesel, in the same way, Wiesel writes Night the way he does because he wants to evoke a memory that would cause people to feel empathy as much as they can, and to be the kinds of people that wouldn't allow something like this to happen again. I think what Wiesel fears most is not getting the right theory, but of losing the memory of the Holocaust, losing the memory in such a way that we don't respond and allow it to happen again. And it's a very iconic understanding of memory. It's a memory that through the Book of Night we can imagine as much as possible what it's like to be in that kind of situation, and to evoke the kinds of feelings that we would not that would make us the kind of people that perhaps would fight against that kind of tragedy. That's in a way that's why the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is so brilliant, because it's constructed for people to feel when they walk through and when they walk out, and not just simply to get like cognitive information, right? There's something performative about that museum that's very, very powerful. And also the Museum of African American Studies and at Washington, D.C. as well. So that's my first point, and maybe I'll stop here just to hear your thoughts, because I do want to end with a little reflection on something related to all this as well, about evil and love, and perhaps a passage in the passage in the Grand Inquisitor, which I think indicates Dostoevsky's response, really, when especially in the Grand Inquisitor, I'll try to find it here. When the Grand Inquisitor basically tells Jesus that you overestimated human beings' capacity, right? That's on page 256. To come down from the cross, and we will believe that it is you. You did not come down because, again, you did not want to enslave man by a miracle. and thirsted for faith that is free, not miraculous. You thirsted for love that is free, and not for the servile raptures of a slave before a power that has left him permanently terrified. So I think it gets back to this idea of this is not a theodicy. It's just simply a fact that in the face of evil, we're called to have a relationship with God of trust. And in that sense, one that is free, one that is not conditioned on God coming down and solving all our problems, one that is not conditioned on God coming to the rescue. Yeah, and that's a difficult kind of faith. I think to have. So I'll stop there, and would love to hear your thoughts and comments and reflections on this really, really remarkable passage. So
Thank you so much for introducing us to this amazing passage. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. I fear that our time is run out, but I'm sure this is a topic which could go on to eternity. But thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. Someone actually, be great if someone did the Grand Inquisitor as well, and then we could just do part two or something.
Right.
Part two or something.
Yes, that would be good.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful, really stimulating
Thank you.
time, and goodbye to everyone for
Thank you.
another
Goodbye.
month.
Good to see everyone. Kalopaska.